the specific effects that are measured, and then this calculated endpoints as well. And can you click again for the bottom half of the slide? So this has been done for over 53,000 references that we currently have on the public ecotox website, which results in our ecotox specific controlled vocabularies consisting of over 12,000 chemicals, over 13,000 species, and over 7,000 biological effects that have been measured in these papers, along with thousands of study and result terms talking about the chemical details, the study design, the species characteristics, etc. So clearly this is a lot of information, and given the long history of ecotox, it has developed really focused on our small, narrow world of ecotoxicology in the published literature. But for interoperability, we found we really need to harmonize the identifiers that we use. And for species and chemicals, that's fairly straightforward. And for these other terms in our controlled vocabularies, we're working on mapping them to ontologies. Next slide, please. So this is the diagram that I like to share because I am a visual person. And so we think about, how do we do this? For the chemicals and species, it's fairly straightforward because we have taken what we have in ecotox and made sure that for all the chemicals, we have CAS numbers, and then expanded that to also include the DSS tox substance IDs or DTX SIDs. And for the species, we were originally based on ITIS species IDs and have expanded that where possible to incorporate the NCBI tax IDs. If you click again, there's an animation. And this is great because those identifiers match what is in the AOP wiki with the DTX SID and CAS number for stressors, and the NCBI tax ID for taxonomic applicability. This is true for other databases and tools as well. Next slide. Where things get trickier is when we start talking about all of the effects that are measured in these studies. They're not all reported in the same language and rarely linked to any specific ontology. So we're working to map the ecotox terms to ontologies, and have started shifting our focus to really focus on OBO domain ontologies, just as a cleaner resource. And we're hoping that through this process, we'll be able to better interact and interface with the AOP wiki, either through the ontology-based annotations that have been done a few years ago, or with a future integrated ontology, or perhaps through the resources that Holly just described with the AOP DB. All right, next slide. So just to give a sense of that, we've actually started on this process. These are the current ecotox annotations, the different fields that we populate for every study. As applicable, of course, there's the unique identifiers for chemical and species. But then for test species, we also have information on the life stage, the sex, the source of the organism. For chemicals, we have chemical analysis, the grade, the type, et cetera. And then a lot of information in green on the different test conditions that are there, and then the results. So we are trying to take these vocabularies and map them to ontologies. And if you click to the next slide, I'll show a few examples. And so there's 3 on here. So if you click 2 more times, we'll see all 3 at once. So the first example is if we take a chemical, of course, we not only have the CAS number and the DTX SID, but we can also map it to say it is a chloro-1,3,5-triazine, and we also show that it has the role herbicide and has the role environmental contaminant. I'll click again. And then if we take some of the effects that are measured, such as thyroxine or T4 or triiodothyronine T3, we can see that each of those can be mapped easily to thyroid hormone, and then click again. Or we can take a calculated endpoint such as LC50 and see that that is a concentration response endpoint and is also part of a lethal dose. So this is based on some of the initial mapping that we did for the ontology for the ecotox terms. However, we had some limitations in this, and so we are revamping and restarting this process through a project led by Ron Lin Wang. Can you click again? Take the next slide. And trying to interface not only that ontology mapping with also the idea that the ecotox effects data can be organized in the same framework that the AOP framework is, from lower levels of biological organization to higher levels. And so here we can show in the colorful boxes on the bottom the ecotox effect types, where you can see that you start with the toxicant information, you have some molecular information, cellular or cellular and organ responses, and then up on the right-hand side, you have the downstream organism and population responses. Next slide, please. And so between the combination of organizing the ecotox effects data in that AOP framework, levels of biological organization, and the work in progress, the ontological mapping, we hope that the ecotox effects data can be helped to inform the development of new AOPs, such as this example here, where we pulled zebrafish studies where zebrafish of all life stages had been exposed to PFAS and organized the results from ecotox in that hierarchical manner to start looking at putative AOPs. This was done manually, but we hope that in the future this could be more of an automated or semi-automated approach. And next slide. And then also these two steps could also help us provide support or expand existing AOPs. And this is where we had done some comparisons with our initial mapping of ecotox terms. And this example I'm showing here is to AOP 25. And you can see on the bottom, it's the ontology-based annotations with the process, object, and action from Ives et al. On 2017. And then we compared that to the mappings, the early mappings of the ecotox terms to ontologies. And you can see there's definitely a lot of overlap, and then also some questions where we ended up mapping ecotox terms to ontologies that didn't have strong definitions or were at a different level of granularity than what we have in ecotox. So next slide, I think this should be my last one. So in summary, in working in ecotox and developing AOPs, we've realized there's just a lot of commonality in the data and the data needs between these two sources and tools. And so we're working to update the controlled vocabularies in ecotox and incorporate the harmonized identifiers, as well as a project led by Ron Ling Wayne to semanticize the ecotox controlled vocabularies and develop an ecotox application ontology. So with this, we're hoping that we'll be able to interface with any updated ontology-based annotations or ontological mapping that's happening on the AOP wiki side so that we can have better connections between these two tools. I think it's actually a two-way path here. We also are really interested if AOP wiki is able to incorporate gene and protein identifiers, because that's an area that we have a lot of new data coming out in the ecotoxicological literature, and getting identifiers there would be really helpful for making those linkages. And finally, one of the things that we are heading in the direction of is really trying to link to other sources based on references. And so publications, as they're included in AOPs, I think that would be a lot of value in having some sort of indexing of citations and references that could allow for linkages based on common identifiers such as DOI or HEOR ID between ecotox and AOP, as well as other sources. I think that's all I have, and sorry if I just talked really fast, but I'm pretty excited about the opportunities here. So thank you, Vasilis, for running my slides. And one final note is if anybody has any ideas or questions, please reach out to me.
Yeah, so I think that's all. I'm stop sharing. The floor is back on you, Dan, I believe.
Yeah, thanks to Vasilis, Holly, and Jennifer for the presentations. So we'll have a breakout discussion on interoperability and some of these ideas and thoughts following the next two presentations. So our next speaker is going to be Nate Pollesch from US EPA. Actually, I think if it's all right with you, Nate, I think Bette maybe had to leave a little early. So if we could go with Bette first, that'd be all right. No, the agenda had the other way around, but So actually, we're going to go ahead with Bette Meek, who's going to talk about some concepts related to the AOP page and updates to that in terms of potential regulatory application. Take it away, Bette.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Right, so you are seeing my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, right. So I had been asked to contribute a few thoughts concerning re-envisaging the AOP page to support regulatory application. And I really wanted to emphasize that these are really very preliminary thoughts to contribute to the mix to evolve content of the AOP page in the context of some of the other kind of proposed advancements to the AOP wiki, particularly in relation to the visualizations, the evolving data model that Jason's introduced, but also this potential to have different interfaces for different users. I think that would resolve a number of the issues, actually. So just some high-level considerations, the context for the regulatory community. For application, it's the pathway that counts rather than the modular elements. And of course, there's a wide range of regulatory applications and audiences for which different levels of information are required. Transparency is key in terms of engendering trust, so it's providing access to the supporting information. It's helpful to consult and engage the regulatory community to effectively design and communicate to meet their needs. I know that's a challenge because they're really busy like everyone else, but we have had some fairly successful engagement models in the past. And I guess the fundamental question that I'm asking is, can we get better focus on the pathway to simplify the AOP page for regulatory application? There's much focus in the AOP wiki on the modular elements, and that's really important to support sharing and crowdsourcing in the development of AOPs. We can't apply AOPs in regulatory or any other context if we don't have any. But the unit of application is the AOP, and could we kind of consider earlier, more pathway related aspects to increase efficiency? And really, do we have the appropriate balance between the content assimilated for the pathway on the AOP page and that for its component key events and key event relationships? And if not, how do we better integrate and simplify? So a little bit about the background.
Bette?
Yep.
I think you may be showing a different screen because we're still, or at least I'm still seeing your first slide and it's not in presentation mode.
Oh my, okay.
Yeah, so it just changed. Oh, and yeah, oh, we were almost there.
Oh my, okay.
It flipped to the notes slide and then it flipped back to the maybe are you sharing the file or the application instead of your screen? That could be it.
Yeah, I'm sharing the application actually, but I have two screens, so
yeah, so when you share the application, when you go in presentation mode, it doesn't follow, like, so it's staying on the
okay, so I should stop sharing then and share my screen.
yeah. If you share the screen where the presentation, like the full screen version was, then that should.
Okay. Is that working yet?
I'm still seeing just the slide, like the non-presentation slides.
Okay, that's.
Yeah, it flips briefly over to the like the presenter view where it's got the slide and then the next slide and the notes, but then it always bounces back to the, if you don't have any animations, you probably can just flip through, like instead of going in presentation mode, because at least for me, it's plenty big. So you could probably just page through the slides.
Okay, sorry about that. So this is a new computer and it's, I guess the setup is slightly different. Okay, so, right, are we okay there?
Yeah, I'm seeing background, OECD objectives,
Yeah,
relevance. Yep.
Right. So I really, I wanted to talk about the background in terms of OECD objectives relevance to regulatory, because I know there's been discussions earlier in some of these groups in terms of what's the target audience for the AOP wiki. Should it be a more kind of laissez-faire kind of wiki-based collaborative platform? And we've always considered the kind of the regulatory audience to be an important audience because it really relates to the context for the AOP framework. Regulatory agencies and risk assessors are considered in an OECD context as the principal target audience for the AOP framework to facilitate translation and uptake of mechanistic data at molecular and cellular level. So really anchoring to the adverse outcomes. So these are the kind of regulatory endpoints previously defined. But also to assist in establishing these causal relationships between molecular and cellular effects and the adverse outcome and associated identification of critical data gaps. So the important aspect here is really reference to the causality, and that relates to the burden of proof to facilitate the uptake of mechanistic data by the regulatory community. And of course, that's what the basis, the extent of evidence supporting causality is addressed in the AOP descriptions by the weight of evidence considerations. I think you're all familiar with them, and I don't want to say very much about them here, except to emphasize a couple of points that they do draw upon regulatory experience and pathway analysis for chemical specific mode of action. That experience constitutes the basis for what we've referenced as their codification, defining their focus, indicating the nature of the data that informs them, and providing examples of the types of evidence bases associated with higher, moderate, or low confidence. So that's the inclusions in Annex 1. Their assessment is relevant principally to the level of integration. So you're really looking across different levels of biological organization, though we assimilate the data for AOP components, the key events and key event relationships. And they're really helpful in identifying influential studies, so facilitating the research regulatory interface. And they're kind of widely recognized as part of the value added of AOPs over other mechanistic constructs. And that again relates to this kind of regulatory perspective that we really need some evidence of causality. So I guess the questions, what do the regulatory community want to know really? It's transparency critical relating to the context and strategy for evidence identification, but also the bounds and relative confidence and limitations of the AOP to support any required application. So the wiki and handbook have both continued to evolve to provide greater transparency in some of these areas. So that was really the origin of the Systematic Methods Initiative. It led to inclusion in the 2022 release of the Handbook Wiki of the AOP Development Strategy, essentially to address both context and strategy in the evidence collection strategy, document the overall and more specific hierarchical data identification strategy. So prior to that, that really wasn't evident from the AOP descriptions. Beyond that, we've been working to provide example-tailored context-dependent workflows on the application of more systematic methods in AOP development to provide efficient and transparent support for a principally expert-driven process. So again, and of course, Jason's presentation earlier on the structured data extraction templates in the evolving data model certainly contribute to that in terms of increasing transparency. Another aspect of the evolution of the guidance or the handbook and the wiki was this inclusion of this generalized workflow for AOP development in the 2023 release. So, so it reflects the current organization of the wiki descriptions of AOPs with some upfront consideration of the context of development and the development strategy in the first steps, but it's followed by text to encourage early consideration of the pathway related priorities in AOP development. And really it's a bit like problem formulation, that as AOP developers start to develop their AOPs, they really need to think about what's the overall objective in terms of the assessment of the AOP, what's going to appear on the AOP page. So it's really the text that was added following the kind of workflow is that, you know, developers are encouraged to consult the weight of evidence considerations to focus on or design studies that best address the guiding questions in Annex 1. And it can be really helpful in streaming search strategies to focus on the most important information to increase efficiency. For example, the pathway studies documenting dose-response relationships at several levels of biological organization can really cut to the quick and robustly informing the extent of, for example, empirical support and essentiality. So it was really that evolution that prompted thinking about how to reorganize or evolve the handbook to better address the pathway as the important output for the user community. And what's been proposed is to better integrate the content of Section 4, the overall assessment of the AOP, the appendices, the weight of evidence considerations and extent of quantitative understanding in the handbook with the content of the AOP page, and to address some inconsistencies between content of the guidance for pathway assessment versus modular components, because there are a number of inconsistencies currently in the handbook. So the other point is that the context for regulatory and other applications varies considerably. Regulatory kind of applications are conducted for many different purposes. The principal regulatory drivers are really this greater reliance on mechanistic data, the expanded chemical assessment programs, but also reduction of animal testing for example, the cosmetics mandates. And in these expanded chemical assessment programs, we have very tiered assessment strategies where we move from priority setting to screening to preliminary or full hazard characterization. And the public health impact or the cost or values of that information increase as you move down that continuum. It really necessitates higher levels of certainty and confidence in the underlying database. And that really requires, for any of the regulatory users, is going to require access to increasing amounts of information. And that's also true for more efficient and predictive testing strategies or integrated approaches to testing and assessment. So we had rather suggested that maybe we could simplify the AOP page for the regulatory application community by having this interactive AOP graphical representation and network view linking to additional layered information. And that could be, for example, the KE and KER evidence tables that are evolving in the data model, but also the supporting references. So this is the current content of the AOP page based on the 2023 handbook. So it contains a relatively large number of sections that include both factual content and expert-informed judgments. To the extent possible, those expert-informed judgments should be pathway-based for the AOP page, but they're sometimes presented in the context of the modular components. So you can see this combination of factual, for example, the AOP identifier and title, the authors of the AOP, the handbook versioning, versus the graphical representations of the AOP and the network view, and then some more judgmental content, particularly for the overall assessment. So I think it's a question of how we overlay these kind of judgments with the kind of the evidence tables, the kind of trying to kind of automate the assimilation of the data for that purpose. And so the nature, I took a look at some of the nature of the content of the AOP pages in existing AOPs. They're often very lengthy with variable content. They're normally within the range of about 20 pages. They necessarily have a mix of tabular and free text entries with some linked supporting content, for example, for the key events, the key event relationships, the taxonomic applicability, and the stressors table. But I found myself asking the question after having considered the content on the AOP page for several AOPs as to how the regulatory community might distill the relevant information to determine its suitability for a particular application. In part, I think that relates to the organization, but also to the extent of the information included on the modular elements. So you can kind of envisage potentially evolved and simplified content of the AOP page. You can introduce the kind of factual information as it is now. And in terms of having the kind of summary information on the AOP, you would want the abstract and interactive graphical representation and network view linked to the hierarchically organized evidence tables and supporting references. And then, of course, the additional content on prototypical stressors, which is tabular and could be linked, and the life stage taxonomy and sex applicability, the summary at the AOP level, and linked evidence tables. And I think we can structure these summaries to a greater extent than we have done in the past. Certainly for the AOP development strategy, that's possible. And then, of course, the lengthiest section is actually on the overall assessment. And that's because it relates largely to the presentation of the judgments on the weight of evidence consideration. So it seems to me that the problem there is that we're really presenting in the context of the modular elements, and there's really no assimilated overview. So with respect to the biological domain of applicability of the AOP, that's fairly easily addressed through the most restrictive of the AOP components. But this evidence of assessment, it really needs to be based on pathway consideration. What you're trying to address is where in the pathway do we have data and confidence? And once you've assessed that, you identify the relevant uncertainties and inconsistencies. But thinking of it more in a pathway context than on the individual kind of components, the KEs and the KERs. So we don't want to imply also that we require information on all key events in the pathway, because we don't. And what you're really looking for is the data sufficiently supportive of expected patterns across levels of biological organization. And so I think what we probably need to do is restrict the confidence calls to pathway consideration on the AOP page, rather than the components, and additionally structure that. So the Annex 1 presentation currently has provision for confidence calls on each element of the weight of evidence considerations, and in some cases in relation to each of the KEs or KERs. And I think largely that we need an overview summary of pathway considerations on the AOP page, and then we would link to the evidence table assimilation for the components without those confidence calls. The guidance for the structure for the content of the summary for the overall assessment can be developed upon drawing upon experience to date. I certainly saw some really, really nice examples of the data assimilation for consideration of the Bradford Hill considerations in assessing the overall weight of evidence. So I think it's a question of really going through those to provide the kinds of guidance that people need in terms of how they might structure that and assess overall confidence in the pathway. Some of the examples of context for guidance for the assimilated summary of weight of evidence on the AOP page. You have evidence on the weight of evidence elements for what proportion and parts of the pathway. It's helpful to understand the proximity of the evidence collected to the adverse outcome on which KERs, how close they are to the adverse outcome. Confidence in the extent and consistency of the overall evidence with expected patterns if the AOP is supported. And can we envisage pathway-related experimental protocols to additionally inform? And then I think we also need to consider the contribution of evolving networks. How does that add to our confidence in the adverse outcome pathway? The other aspect is to incorporate rating relative weighting and any overlap of the lines of evidence, so that the Bradford Hill considerations are rank ordered, but we've never actually taken that into account in assessing kind of confidence because we've considered them really separately in relation to the modular elements of the adverse outcome pathway. And then I think there's a kind of a number of questions here. And I think I raised some of these because of a discussion I am familiar with earlier in in some of the discussions for evolution of the of Wiki 3. Who are the intended clients? What are the requirements? Because you kind of need to design the system for that purpose. Are they AOP developers? Are they the regulatory community, or are they both? Or could we address the needs of the regulatory community with a different interface? What's the envisaged priority consultation evolution strategy for the interface? For example, the visualizations and the data model, particularly depending on the clientele, and any other suggestion regarding the AOP page to better serve regulatory need, if that's a priority. And then I think in terms of staging and priority, it's really, I'm not entirely sure what will fall out when, or what will be supported with available resources for development of the Wiki 3.0. So again, I think that's probably something in terms of how we would orchestrate any revision of the handbook to better support kind of regulatory application. So I think I'll leave it at that and stop sharing. And apologies for the technical glitches.
No problem. Thanks, Betty. Any quick clarifying questions before we move on to the next speaker? Otherwise, we have time for discussion during the breakouts. So thanks, Betty, for teeing things up. There's been a lot of activity on the mural board while you were speaking. So there's a lot of questions and discussion that people are ready to have. All right, so with that, we'll turn it over to Nate to talk about emergent AOPs and semantic analysis.
All
Take away,
right.
Nate.
All right, will do. Let's see, let's get this screen shared here. So this is actually jumping towards the end. Do you all see a worksheet here, or a workbook here with a bunch of stuff in it?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so I'm bringing this up quickly because I know Betty said she had to leave, but anyway, I just wanted to point out quickly here that part of this work is to essentially, we're developing quality metrics. And for Betty, before she takes off, part of this, the metrics that we're developing for emergent AOPs, which I will get to in a moment, we can use these same metrics for the AOPs that are in there. And these are a pathway-based metric. So a little bit of a teaser for you, Betty. So if you want to chat about this at some point, we can come back to it. But and I will, and if you are here towards the end, I will actually talk about this a little bit more. But it's something that we're working on. So anyway, so let's get into the slideshow now. So yeah, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about discovering and assessing the quality of emergent AOPs. And so part of this is old work, and then part of this is new work. And so one thing that's really nice so far about today, getting the recap, is that there's a lot of tools. When I mentioned part of this is old work, is that some of this, some of the emergent AOPs that we're using in the current to sort of build the metrics and look at these quality approaches were something that were identified about 5 years ago now. But it looks like a bunch of the tools that are available might make this process a lot easier. So exciting to see some of this stuff. And yeah, so the old work that I'm mentioning was work with myself and Dan and Jason O'Brien. And the new work is work with Jennifer Olker, who we heard from before, and Ranling Wang. And so, yeah, and so just to give a little bit of background, I'm just going to very quickly talk about the discovery process for the emergent AOPs. And so in this case, everyone is very comfortable with viewing AOPs as a network. And let's see, I'm hearing something from Jason. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Anyway, so but one of the things that's important in here is this idea of a linear pathway or a pathway, and so I'll describe why in a moment. But so again, thinking about discovering AOPs, emergent AOPs, how do we find them? And so a little bit about those methods, which becomes relevant when we're thinking about updates to the AOP wiki. Essentially, the key event relationship information was downloaded from the AOP wiki and used to create an edge list to create these networks. It was converted using iGraph in RStudio. And so this was the information that served the basis for us being able to build the analyses that we did. And everything was implemented in R. This is a very old image of the AOP wiki at the time that we did it, and just to give an idea of what the AOP wiki looks like as an entire network. So what are the attributes we pulled out at the time? So in our code, we're using information from the AOP wiki, such as the key event ID, the AOP ID, the designator, the level of biological organization. In terms of the KERs, we're pulling out the KER ID, the AOP ID associated with the KERs, weight of evidence, and the quantitative understanding. Right. So now let's talk about emergent AOPs for a second. So essentially, we've got this idea for anybody who may not be familiar with this. Essentially, if you've got two AOPs and they share a key event, there's a potential for an emergent AOP to exist. And when we talk about emergent AOPs, or when I talk about them, these are all linear paths. And so here we've got some hypothetical AOP1 that goes, a nice linear path from MIE1 to AO1 through KE1 here. These aren't the actual KEs, and MIE is just numbered this way for simplicity. And AOP2 has a couple of pathways, and so it could go through KE1 to AO2, or it could go through KE2 to AO2. And when we network these things together, to get a feel for how the different paths through this AOP network would be quantified, well, we've got sort of these units could potentially be in the AOP. So this AOP1 is a linear AOP in its own right. AOP2 is technically a network AOP in its own right. Within each of these, within AOP1, we have a single linear pathway. Within AOP2, we have two linear pathway, and these would be considered like expert-specified linear AOPs. And that's because these were created by somebody going into the AOP wiki and doing that. However, when we network these things or look at the AOP wiki from a networked view, we see that there's emergent pathways that get created by the key event sharing. And so in this case, when we consider the fact that these two both share key event 1 here, we can see two new emergent pathways. And so this is at the heart of what an emergent AOP is and how they get created. So again, in this example, just to get the numbers right, there were sort of two AOPs, two different AOP IDs, three unique expert-specified linear AOPs, and then two unique emergent AOPs. Right. So we did this for the AOP wiki. At the time, there was 187 AOPs. We found 471 unique expert-specified linear AOPs and about 9,500 emergent linear AOPs. So, and this number has gone up significantly since then. I think Jason O'Brien's on here today, and he keeps track of how these numbers are growing, and it's gone up significantly. But what this means is that there is a ton of information in here that might be useful or not. The conversations about biological domains of applicability and things like this are extremely relevant for figuring out if these things are useful or not. So, onto the new work. So the new work right now is really based on developing metrics to analyze the quality of these emergent AOPs and automated or semi-automated metrics to do this. And so this is really pulling from work that was led by Ronling Wang. So I think all the other co-authors of both of these papers are on here except for Ronling, which is interesting because he went through and essentially did the process of converting the key events to their logical definitions, which out of all the research here, this is the stuff I'm the least comfortable with. So anyway, but essentially what it comes down to is all the key events were converted to logical definitions using, as much information as available on the AOP wiki. So it wasn't just, from what I understand, it wasn't just utilizing just the terms in the key event descriptions. I believe Ronling went in and used any information that was available for the different key events. So using some of those fields like domain of applicability and things like that. So what got created out of this was essentially a semantic network. So he did this for all of the key events in the AOP wiki, so that he could start to look at semantic similarity. So this is just an overview, a messy image of the semantic similarity network for the AOPs, mixed with these other CSPPs, genes, pathways, and diseases. So this was all the information that got created in order to do this semantic analysis. And again, I would refer you to Ron Ling to talk about that. But one of the things I can talk about and will talk about here is what that enabled us to do. So from the semantic similarity network, essentially Ron Ling went in and calculated pairwise semantic similarity scores. And so what we've got here is for every pair of key events, whether they are in an AOP or not, you can get a semantic similarity score. And so he did this. And then in this case, this is just ordering them based on their semantic similarity scores. Higher scores are more semantically similar. And furthermore, he went through and looked at all of the AOPs that were in the AOP wiki and did the same thing. Utilizing these scores, he applied came up with a metric for semantic similarity for the AOP. And the way that he did this was to look at the mean pairwise semantic similarity. So what does that mean? That means that in an AOP, you look at every possible, not just downstream and upstream similarity of key events. You look at the pairwise semantic similarity score of all key events. So this, if the AOP had 5 key events in it, this would also consider the semantic similarity of the MIE to the AO, regardless of if they have some sort of KER connecting them or not. So, and then you take the mean of those. And this is one way to get at an idea of semantic similarity for an AOP. And also sort of at the heart of this is the idea that a higher quality AOP should have a higher semantic similarity score. So that is the baseline assumption here. Right. So, so I ran into Ron Lang and I saw that he was doing this with the AOPs, and I was like, hey, I've got a bunch of emergent AOPs that I would love to see what this looks like for. And so, so a couple of years ago at CTAC, Jennifer and Ron Ling and I had a discussion about this. And essentially, I sent Ron Ling the list of all these expert specified AOPs that we had identified, and then also the emergent AOPs that we had identified. And so we have just been running and developing metrics now for semantic similarity. So, so for us, there's a couple of different metrics that we're looking at here. And the part of the reason we're doing this is because when you deal with something that's like you can look at with semantic similarity, again, you can compare or you can look at the semantic similarity score of key events that are sequential or related or directly upstream or downstream from each other, but you can also look at key events that are across the entire AOP, whether they have a KER between them or not. And so part of what we are investigating is which of these metrics actually is most useful for looking at the quality here. And so this notation is a little bit heavy here, but essentially we looked at a couple different things. And so the first one is this idea of this sequential semantic similarity, tongue twisters throughout today. And this is saying that for a given AOP or EAOP, so you could apply this to either type of object, it doesn't matter. The sequential semantic similarity, we look at the mean of those and we look at the minimum of those. And the idea of the mean is similar to what we would see essentially like what's the average score sequentially when we look at a KE to KE. And this is actually something that, in this case would follow the key event relationships. So sequential semantic similarity scores, you can only use this metric on AOPs that are all connected by key event relationships. A slightly more discriminating score that we introduced here was the semantic sequential semantic similarity, the minimum of that. And in this case, the minimum is going to be more restrictive and in essence, sort of look for the weakest link in the chain when it comes to semantic similarity. So, if you've got an AOP that 3 of the 4 sequential key event relationships are high, have high semantic similarity, and one is very low, the mean is still going, the mean is going to represent that. It may be non-zero. If you have one key event relationship or one sort of pair of key events that are sequential that has a very low or 0 semantic similarity score, the minimum is going to pull that out and it's going to essentially just assign the value of 0 for that entire metric for that. And so this gets at the idea, again, the weakest link in the chain. And so, and then also we completed when we the pairwise semantic similarity score again, and this is just the way to formally write that up. But the idea here is to develop different metrics based on this data and see which metrics are actually providing us the most useful information. So let's see. So here's some of the preliminary results. So one of the things that I want to point out here is we do this analysis on all the AOPs that we had and all the emergent AOPs that we had and saw how they compared. And so in essence, this is just a little bit more visual way to look at it. But one of the things that's really interesting here is even though there's, about 10,000 of the emergent AOPs, and in this case, a couple hundred of the AOPs, we had the average sort of scores for these metrics is actually pretty similar. So this is encouraging, right? This means that, although we know that there is a ton of non-biological sort of computational stuff that appears when we do this analysis for the emergent AOPs, this also tells us that in terms of using these metrics, that there could be, and there likely is, some high quality information contained within the emergent AOPs. And now we have a method to prioritize the emergent AOPs to look at them. And so, so essentially what I just said there, so the first round of results is pretty exciting. Why? And it essentially just means that there is a high potential for useful information from these emergent AOPs, and now we've developed a method to identify and prioritize them to be looked at by experts to make sure that, in fact, things that are highly semantically similar using these metrics are actually useful information to potentially include. So, so what's next? So I'll flip over to the let's see, to this worksheet just for a minute here, only because I brought it up before, so I'll come back to it. But one of the things that we also did here was compare these metrics to some quantitative versions of the weight of evidence scores and the quantitative understanding scores to see how well, and compare the metrics to each other to see if we go through, calculate these metrics for every single AOP, all the emergent AOPs, how well does the ranking of the AOPs in terms of the highest quality, the lowest quality, how well do they correlate with each other? And so this is the most recent stuff. And so hot off the presses, and I'll also mention that this other work is work in progress. So we're still getting this stuff figured out here. But this is, so these correlations are interesting. It's good to know. Some of these make a lot of sense. Ideally, we would want the majority of these metrics to correlate highly with each other. We would sort of want our idea of quality to be high across the different metrics. Some of them, again, are when you consider something like when we're taking the minimum of these things to aggregate, yeah, you've got an opportunity to, it's a slightly different view, but either way, so the correlation is like fairly high across the different semantic similarity metrics. However, in a very quick take on looking at doing sort of a quantitative version of the quantitative understanding and the weight of evidence, we see that these metrics don't actually correlate very well with one another. So there's more to do here, but this was just to get an idea of how these things are sort of stacking up with one another. So, right. So, essentially we've used these metrics to identify and prioritize a list of the emergent AOPs that we want to look at, and essentially, start to do some manual inspection. So do these results pass the sniff test? In one early iteration, we had an emergent AOP that was identified as being having high semantic similarity. However, the biology in it just didn't make any sense. It started in plants and ended in liver steatosis. And so, these are the things we want to flag. And so, and then see, are there patterns in highly semantically similar linear AOPs, whether they be emergent or not? And then, and again, identifying some of these outstanding, highly sort of scored emergent and regular linear AOPs to look at as a case study. So, and again, so I just gave you a preview of how these metrics compare to other quality metrics. And so, just coming back again to the idea of the AOP wiki, so which aspects of this really enable these analysis? And as a recap, this all the analysis that you saw in terms of identifying the emergent AOP, this was the information that went into it. And so In terms of the semantic analysis, it's essentially was the key event descriptions and any supplementary information on applicability that was available at the time when Ron Ling did the conversion. What aspects of these analysis could be useful in the AOP wiki? Well, with Emergent AOP, again, that paper came out a little while back, so you can get an idea of how involved different key events are in Emergent AOPs. You've got high quality, from the Emergent AOPs, if we can identify and come up with methods to identify the high quality ones and verify that they're providing useful information, this is something that could just be explicitly added to the AOP wiki. And again, if there's 20 of these for every, 20 Emergent AOPs for every, regular expert AOP that's existing in the AOP wiki, that there's a potential for a lot of information. In terms of the semantic analysis, so one of the things that's really interesting about the semantic similarity scores is that this exists for any pair of key events in the AOP wiki. So and Ron Lang in his paper actually identifies some things that are useful. So I'll finish this thought for a second. So we can calculate this semantic similarity scores. It gives us an idea of a quality metric, another type of quality metric that we can use. And one of the things that's interesting that Ron Ling talks about that's relevant today is this, to me, I just got introduced to the idea of the umbrella key events, but what we see here is this is a figure straight out of his paper, and essentially what the semantic analysis has allowed him to do is to identify groups of key events that could be potentially combined together. And so, and this gives us a method or an approach for doing that. So we can see here, this is a way to simplify, some of the relationships. If you wanted to group key event 540, 657, and 660 together, where they're separate up here, that could create this sort of umbrella key event. Hopefully I'm using that term properly, and simplify the overall AOP network. Another thing is that using this, you could get an opportunity of sort of suggested KEs based on semantic similarity score. So if you're an AOP developer and you're looking for, what might be the next key event, if we've got this info, and it would be based on the information that's in there, but it could potentially say, would you consider this as your next key event in the AOP, and so forth. So that's what I put together for you today. I've got a sort of a small list of things I wanted to just make sure I touched on based on the conversation today. So yeah, the first thing was just to see, really neat to see some of the new tools that are coming online. This type of work sort of motivates the additional development of the biological plausibility of these different essentially our work here is to develop methods to evaluate the biological plausibility of these emergent AOPs. So this is important in our work here. The work on domains of applicability and expanding that information is super important for this. And then relative to coming up with these metrics for overall scores and weights on the AOPs, whether they are user specified or emergent AOP, this is getting at that side of things as well. So so that's what I prepared for you, and I'll end it there.
Great, thanks, Nate. Really interesting presentation, and really fascinating to see how we might be able to use some of these semantic scoring approaches to assess quality of these emergent AOPs. So we are currently at about halfway through the 3-hour session. So we've got about 90 minutes left on the calendar. So I would propose that we take a short 5-minute bio break while we get the breakout room set up. So we'd ask that folks converge maybe back at 35 minutes after the hour. So I guess it's about 4 minutes. It'll be quick. But at about 35 minutes after the hour or so, please come back and join the breakout group or the breakout room that has the topic of interest. We'll plan to spend about 25 to 30 minutes in those breakouts, and then there'll be a pause where things will get potentially reshuffled. You don't have to leave your original breakout. If you're having a great discussion, you can just go right back into that room. But that's sort of just a signal that, we're about halfway through the time that's left, and you might want to jump over to another breakout session. So with that, I'll stop talking and give everybody a minute to
Oh, and
take
Dan,
yep, go ahead.
I think Jolly has offered, probably most people at this point have used Mural, and if so, please feel free to go for a bio break or some coffee. But if you do want a quick rundown on how to use the Mural boards, Jolly will be doing that during the break.
All right,
and I'm
so
actually going to try and set the correct option this time so that you will be able to choose your rooms when we get back.